there's some still not aware of what God is. God is perfect freedom, justice, equality, and thus the only thing that brings perfect justice, freedom, and equality, perfect love in all of its beauty and holiness is socialism. So God.
918 people. Until the attacks on the Twin Towers on 9/11, 918 people was the highest amount of American civilian lives lost in a single deliberate event. This event is known as the Jonestown Massacre, which, as the name suggests, took place in Jonestown, Guyana on November 18, 1978. Jim Jones, the creator of the cult, is largely, if not entirely, held responsible for the massacre, despite it not being a massacre in the typical sense. Jones used various methods to manipulate a person's beliefs and actions to meet his own wants. Some of these methods are conditioning of followers through trust exercises, public punishments, and equating himself to a religious prophet. His actions as a leader changed the lives of countless Americans and have been continuously emulated by the cult leaders in the years to follow. Jonestown was built by the People's Temple, an offshoot of Christianity that morphed many Christian beliefs with Marxist political ideologies. This religion ironically denounced organized religion for unevenly distributing power, although it itself subtly took power from the mass of the patrons and allowed various higher-ranking officials to make executive decisions for the entirety of the church. Jim Jones was the creator and leader of the People's Temple, which he founded in Indiana in 1955. Jones came from a rough family with an abusive and alcoholic father and extremely religious mother. Jones was eventually appointed the director of Indiana's Human Rights Commission and integrated not only his churches but other businesses and social settings as well. Jim Jones later moved the church from Indiana to California in 1963 under the premise that it was safer from Jones's predicted nuclear holocaust, which would take place on July of 1967, in which socialists would eventually rule the earth. As the People's Temple taught socialist ideology and many of the patrons were very devout, a relatively large group of members followed Jones in his migration from Indianapolis to Redwood Valley, California. While in San Francisco, Jim Jones and the People's Temple assisted in the successful election of the mayor, George Moscone, by providing a crucial 2,000 votes, which swung the election in Moscone's favor. Through his collaboration, Jim Jones gained political power and eventually had members of the People's Temple assume positions in the government. This allowed Jones to call in political favors and allowed him to get various permits to aid in the expansion of the church, both geographically, through adding more places of worship, as well as socially, through protest against less progressive groups and ideals. As the People's Temple became more and more ideologically polar, so too did its constituents. It became customary for Jones to punish members for being unfaithful to the church. Punishments ranged from public humiliation to group beatings. After several of these events occurred, loved ones of members began to contact the press and authorities. Allegations of Jones sexually abusing members of the church began to surface. As people started to come forward, more and more attention was drawn to the church. A series of articles by Lester Kinselman detailing not only the defection of several members from the People's Temple, but also their inner workings and methods of punishment. The church's existence was on the line. Around this time, Jones took an extended vacation to Brazil. He returned with an idea of a utopia, one completely self-sufficient and entirely isolated from society, aside from for basic communication and to make a profit. It would be based entirely on communist ideologies and be named after its charismatic leader. It would be called Jonestown. Jonestown construction broke ground in 1974 on 3,800 acres of land in northwestern Guyana. Guyana was an ideal location for the People's Temple. The country had socialist views, was isolated, and predominantly comprised of native people, which would allow the African American members of the church a more accepting and peaceful place to live. 500 people initially moved to Guyana to construct the compound. By 1976, several hundred people had begun to live in Jonestown. It started out beautifully. Everyone was healthy, happy, and content with their lives. Everyone coexisted with one another. But then, Jones got sick. The local doctor diagnosed Jones with an infection in his lungs. Despite the fact that Jones' sickness was only an infection, he told his followers he had lung cancer, for sympathy. As his sickness worsened, Jones became more and more psychotic. He organized white night drills, where at random points he and his men would round up all the citizens of Jonestown and tell them to drink a juice he had prepared in order to test their faith. Loudspeakers would play a recording of Jones's voice throughout the day and night. Town members weren't allowed to contact their family back in the United States. Jones created a system in which trust was non-existent. Children would report their parents, friends and colleagues would become more secretive. No one was safe. Back in San Francisco, Congressman Leo Ryan, who had personal ties to the church, was made aware of the strange occurrences in Guyana by family members of the citizens of Jonestown. He and a group of reporters were granted access to visit Jonestown. They stayed in Jonestown, interviewed various members of the People's Temple, and attended a banquet held in their honor. Although in the interviews everyone appeared to be happy, notes were passed to a cameraman in the press group saying that several members were unhappy with Jonestown and wanted to leave. A child reportedly saw the note being passed and immediately notified everyone in the area, including Jim Jones. The next morning, several more people met with Congressman Ryan and begged him to allow them to accompany him back to the United States. Ryan, of course, obliged. Later, Ryan conducted a personal interview with Jones. Despite Ryan's assurance that he'd give Jonestown a fabulous report when he returned to the United States, Jones remained uneasy. His paranoia worsened. When Congressman Ryan and his associates, along with the refugees from Jonestown, attempted to board the plane that afternoon, they were detained by Jones's personal guards. The guards shot and killed nearly all of the people attempting to board. The only survivor was a cameraman who pretended to have died from the gunshot wound he already sustained. Meanwhile in Jonestown, Jones gathered all of his followers together. He discussed their possible options, as it was apparent that once the United States realized Ryan was dead, the People's Temple was no longer safe. Several followers suggested moving to Russia, although this was immediately shot down by Jones. The final decision was mass suicide. The babies went first, with their parents administering the poison to them in the form of Kool-Aid mixed with various poisons. The elder members then in turn killed themselves by the same method. As previously stated, Jones used multiple ways to effectively coerce his followers into acting and thinking in his favor. He used religion to draw followers more susceptible to believing without seeing tangible proof. He used public beatings not only to weed out unfaithful members, but also because the threat of pain for disobeying strongly reinforces what Jones believed to be good behavior. Media propaganda such as posters and loudspeakers playing Jones's testaments were common throughout Jonestown. Finally, Jones used trust exercises in which Jones tested the faith of his followers by providing scenarios in which members of the church would have to be willing to sacrifice themselves or others to save him. The fact that Jim Jones was able to convince hundreds of people to willingly commit suicide, as well as take the lives of others, shows his manipulative power as a leader. The techniques used to gain this large influence over people have been copied by other cult leaders in the years following. David Koresh, the leader of the Branch Davidians, led his followers into a firefight against government officials in Waco, Texas. All of the followers died. Marshall Applewhite of the Heaven's Gate led his followers to commit mass suicide in hopes of reaching heaven. The list goes on and on. Many draw parallels between Jim Jones and the infamous Charles Manson. However, they begin to establish similar controlling methods independently, as far as experts are concerned. Despite the similarities between the various groups, the Branch Davidians and Heaven's Gate incidents were much more similar to the Jonestown massacre than it is the Manson family murders, because the Manson family murders were racially charged opposed to religiously. All things considered, Jones was a great leader. For the most part, he led an extremely loyal and organized group of followers. The fact that he knowingly led these followers to their deaths doesn't make him a bad leader, only a bad human being. Our hearts go out to all the families affected by his actions, or by actions of those whom he influenced.